a quest that really encompasses largely the last 200 years of the 2000 that Christianity has existed. In the 19th century, more or less the first 100 years, with a little bit beginning already just before the 19th century, there were many different philosophical schools that all spawned books about the life of Jesus. In an age when science was increasingly coming to doubt the miraculous, there was a rationalist school of philosophy that tried to preserve elements of New Testament faith and the Gospel's pictures of Jesus, but explaining the apparently miraculous with rationalistic explanations. Jesus didn't really walk on the water. There were sandbars or stones shortly beneath the surface, and in the night, in a stormy period of time on the lake, Jesus walked out on these, and it was mistaken for a supernatural event, and other examples of that kind. There was a philosophical school that increasingly studied the religious work of antiquity in terms of myth and in terms of legend, and tried to also wrestle with the question of the miracles of Jesus and of the New Testament, not by giving them scientific explanations, but by saying that these were not written as stories designed to communicate historical fact in the first place. Like many religions in the history of the world, they were sacred myth. They were not true stories of something that happened, but they communicated theological truth, things that people believed were important. There was a school of philosophy known as Romanticism, which for those of you that haven't studied philosophy has nothing to do with Hollywood movies. Back in the era when they were romantic rather than just lustful, which seems to be increasingly the case. And out of this school came a picture of Jesus as a wonderful, kind teacher who inspired the crowds, who uplifted and exalted his audiences with lofty thoughts, but did little that would embroil him in controversies sufficient to get him crucified. And then there was yet another school of thought that today, after another century has passed, is sometimes called the Old or the 19th century liberal position, influential in many aspects of the settling of America back before we had crowded this country to the extent that we have now. And there was optimism that Americans in particular, and Christians as a significant part of them, were going to Christianize the earth. We're going to create a better humanity and a better earth than had ever been seen in its history before. It talked about the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man long before anybody dreamed up inclusive language and the problems that those terms would create. Until at the end of the 19th century, a young German scholar who would live into his 90s, into the 1970s, by the name of Albert Schweitzer, who would go on one day to have an illustrious career in West Africa as a humanitarian doctor, medical doctor, as well as a theologian. Albert Schweitzer wrote a book that was translated into English in 1906 with the title, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And what it was a several hundred-page, very detailed chronicle of all of the different writers in the 19th century and the philosophical schools of thought they represented who had penned lives of Jesus. And what Schweitzer demonstrated in a very devastating expose was that in virtually every case, these authors had simply recreated, today we might say reinvented, Jesus in the image of the school of philosophy to which they belonged. They were not doing pure historical research by a long shot. Interestingly, some would say ironically, Schweitzer himself was a member of a school of theological study that focused on apocalyptic literature. literature about the end of the world, literature from the ancient Jewish and Greek and Christian environment about how the only solution to humanity's plight would be for God to supernaturally intervene into the universe and recreate what humanity could never make right on its own. And ironically, as some would say, Schweitzer, after convincingly showing how so many others had recreated Jesus in their own image, so to speak, in the minds of many, fell victim to the same error as he portrayed in the closing chapters of his book, a Jesus who was a firebrand of a preacher, a radical apocalyptic who believed that God was going to bring about the end of the world within the lifetime of his followers, that his crucifixion would begin the events that would lead to this. But as history has shown, it turned out he was sadly mistaken. And because it became quickly apparent to other scholars that Schweitzer had fell victim to the very same trap that he had so carefully exposed in other writers, a period of time ensued which some more recent scholars have simply dubbed the period of no quest. People still continued to study Jesus. They still continued to write books about him, but not nearly to the same degree, not nearly in the same number, and not nearly with the same confidence that much of anything could be known about Jesus if it seemed we were always doomed to recreate him in his own image. The dominant figure from roughly 1900 to 1950 in New Testament scholarship and in historical Jesus research in particular was another German by the name of Rudolf Bultmann, another man who lived into his 90s and had a very illustrious career. And in one famous quotation in an early writing, Bultmann said that all that we can be certain of about Jesus was that he existed. He moderated that skepticism as his career went on, and in fact he wrote a detailed book about the history of the synoptic tradition, the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in which he did indicate a number of things that he believed could be said about Jesus, but it was a very small shell of the sum total of the four Gospels in the New Testament. Interestingly, philosophically, Bultmann was an existentialist, and his Jesus was also an existentialist. But after World War II and all of the upheavals that created in university life around the Western world, a trio of Bultmann's former graduate students, all now beginning and well into New Testament teaching careers, two of them German, Ernst Käsemann and Günther Bornkamm, and one of them, an American who still teaches here in Southern California, though in retirement, James Robinson, all got together at a reunion in Marburg, Germany for former students of Rudolf Bultmann and held a conference in which papers were given. A couple of them were entitled The New Quest for the Historical Jesus. And these students had come to the conclusion that the skepticism of Bultmann was unwarranted and that more could be said and known about this figure who was the founder of Christianity. They analyzed Jesus' sayings in considerable detail. They suggested that he did and said things that at least implicitly suggested that he believed he was God's agent. Use the term cautiously, Messiah, if you like. But because of the era still coming out of the events of World War II, they focused, in the minds of most scholars who have subsequently read them, too much on Jesus' uniquenesses against his environment, and too little on the ways that Jesus was thoroughly and comfortably Jewish in his first century Jewish milieu.